Nieva Batista writes from Cayuga Centers in New York City. Excellent. Hopefully I got the name right. Heidi Holland from Massachusetts Department of Mental Health. And then quickly here, Maria writes, Bienvenidos a New England. Oh, okay. Yeah. So good afternoon, everybody. And then Carolina writes from Cincinnati, Ohio. I'm a counselor trainee about to start my practice at Central Clinic, working with children and teens, focusing on the Spanish-speaking community. Well, thank you, everybody, so much. We're officially going to be getting started. My name is Juan Velez Court. This conversation piece, it's called Let's Talk About Resilience, Supporting the Mental Health of Latinx Youth and Young Adults. This is going to be an online event. Like I mentioned, it's not a webinar. It's about a conversation. I will be your facilitator for this evening. I'm proudly a person with lived experience, so I'm honored to be the facilitator of this event as somebody that received services when I was a child, when I was an adolescent, when I was a young adult. I feel a little bit old saying when I was, but here we are now having this incredible conversation, and we have two incredible resources that are also going to be presenting here. But like I mentioned, we gathered all of your feedback, all of your responses, because we recognize and acknowledge that right now, with all of the landscape constantly changing, the Latinx youth and young adults are at risk of depression, many different challenges where maybe I don't identify with my surroundings. Somebody that recently moved to a location, or somebody that's been there but has the challenge because of the cultural differences sometimes of engaging in the education system, engaging with my family, engaging with other youth or young adults, and maybe don't identify with what I necessarily experience. So this is going to be a conversation about resilience and what that is like. But obviously, I want to first present both of the resources. They're going to be the ones to speak about why they're here, why they're so happy to be with us. So first, we have Kristine Rodriguez. So Kristine, hello.
Hi. Hi, everyone. I am so happy to be invited here today. Like Juan said, my name is Kristine Rodriguez. I supervise a drop-in center here in Springfield, Massachusetts. We serve young adults 16 to 21. And I've been working with young adults for a really long time. And through this constant change, I am just excited to share my knowledge. Like Juan said, I'm not an expert. We're all experts and we all have something to bring to the table. So I'm excited to join together in this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. And then our next resource, we have Andrea Mendiola.
Thank you. Thank you, Juan. My name is Andrea Mendiola. I'm a psychiatrist, and I work at the Hispanic Clinic, which is part of the Connecticut Mental Health Center. And I mainly see adults, so I usually see the parents of these kids or young adults, but I also work with young adults, which is like 18 to 25 years old. All Spanish-speaking only Hispanic families. And I'm very happy to be here speaking to all of you. Thank you.
No, thank you, Andrea. And as everybody can see, we have very different experiences. So like my experience is non-clinical, but I have worked with systems of care, facilitating activities for children, youth, young adults, and their families. So the whole concept of this online experience is to have this conversation about resilience and what it is. And, you know, just to have like the basic concept of what it is. Resilience is that capacity to recover from the difficulties, the challenges that we have in our community. When we talk about resilience, we recognize that not everybody has the same recovery mechanisms or the access to resources. So it's very important that we have people from North Carolina, Ohio, New York, Tennessee, Massachusetts, because the resilience is going to be a very unique conversation in every single place. But the following question, I'm not just going to ask to Kristine and Andrea. I also ask this for everybody that is in chat. So as I say it here, please feel free to comment. And the question is, why is it important right now in August 2020 that we have this conversation about not just resilience, but specifically resilience in regards to Latinx youth and young adults, starting with Kristine?
I think Juan is a resiliency is ongoing change, right? It's like you said, recovering quickly from difficult situations. Do I think that our Latinx youth recover quickly? No, I think that we've taught them as a Hispanic young adult, right? That parents taught me, get over it. Ya esto tiene que pasar. Like they would tell me, did I recover it or did I just learn to live with it and move on? I think that learning more and educating ourselves on resiliency and how to support the young adults is really key, especially during these times where young adults are constant changes, constant things are happening. There's more social media, there's more news, there's other aspects that impact their resiliency. So I think it's important to talk about those things right now.
Thank you for that, Kristine. And remember, everybody, if you feel comfortable, for example, engaging in Spanish en confianza, pueden hacerlo a través del chat. Todo el mundo se puede confiar en el lenguaje, idioma que se sienta más cómodo. Please engage in whichever language you feel most comfortable. This activity from the MHTTC, like this is exactly what we want, right? To build this welcoming environment. So now with you, Andrea, why do you think it's important that we have this conversation now?
Well, I think this conversation is important anytime, really. And we have the opportunity to have this conversation now, so we should take the opportunity. Resilience is something that I think has evolved over the years, and I have seen less stigma about talking mental illness recently. More people are talking about that. People are more open. It's a change in society, change of generations. We see now, and it has proven to help, that more television people, or I don't know, social media stars or whatever, they are coming out and actually talking about their own mental illness. And it's opening the opportunity for families to talk more about it, for the topic to be part of regular conversations, and it's not such as a taboo conversation. So I think that we should take that advantage now and talk more about resilience and how we can help the young adults, how we can help the families to achieve that and to improve resilience.
No, and thank you for sharing that. And Valerie writes in chat, asking openly to everybody, please share your own definition of resilience. To me, resilience is the capacity to show that all that I've learned from my past builds me and prepares me for a better future. Because even though sometimes it can be very scary, right? You have all these challenges, emotional, physical, cultural challenges, but the resiliency it's like when I get to put into practice everything that I've learned from my family, from my community. And even though it can be uncomfortable, it is the ability, as Laura Smith writes in chat, the ability to bounce back. And Holland writes, resilience is owning your recovery. And something that both, I like that you both mentioned, which is the topic about there's this thing that we don't necessarily talk about, especially within the Latinx youth and young adult community, which is mental health. But when we almost remove the word mental health and talk about how we were raised, a lot of times we go through a lot of traumatizing experiences that we don't even know, right? Sometimes can directly affects us. So even though I think a lot of us recognize that mental health is a taboo topic, why do you think it continues to be so? Because it is a conversation that's been happening across multiple generations, yet even though it's opening up a little bit, it's sometimes still happening. Open question to either one of you and everybody in chat. Why do you think it's so challenging to talk about mental health for Latinx youth or young adults?
I think for to answer your question, Juan, I think it can be a cultural aspect and then a lack of education within cultures. Mental health, like for example, right? If you come from from Puerto Rico and that push to receive mental health services or get access is not as accessible, I would say, as it is here. And then they come here and they don't even know how to access it or how to get those services. So I think that that can kind of be one of the reasons why I think in the youth that I work with and that we work in the drop-in center, we constantly teach how to normalize that. Like, I see a therapist and I am okay with sharing that experience and sharing with youth. I think there needs to be a sense of normalizing your experiences with a therapist. And we've all had bad therapists and good therapists. And I think normalizing those experiences and letting them know that tú no estás loco if you see a therapist. You're not crazy if you go see a therapist. It's just that support, I think, that can help people understand that it's okay to receive mental health services.
No, and thank you for that, Kristine. And I think a really good thing you mentioned there is the topic of education. And here we're talking about basic education, where I remember when I was diagnosed when I was 7 years old. And the moment my family found that out, they thought I was going to die the next day, right? It's like Juan got an expiration date. And the thing is, fortunately, with the case of my mother, she became well educated about my mental health diagnosis. But if you were to try to sit down with a family member or the community, a teacher, and try to explain, hey, here's what, generalized anxiety is, here's what obsessive compulsive disorder is, they become afraid of these words that they didn't exactly know, right? And now I would love to know, in your case, Andrea, would you agree or would like to add to what Kristine mentioned? Or are there other things you would like to add?
I agree. I agree completely. And I think what you're saying, like how to normalize it, it helps a lot. And also, I think the language that we use sometimes limits the access, right? I like, for example, when somebody comes see me to the clinic and I think they have major depressive disorder. I mean, but they don't agree with that. They think they are just a little bit sad, and I agree with those terms. If those terms are going to help them move on, accept some help, some treatment, I would only use like having like a little bit sadness as what they are experiencing, because that's the way that they are seeing their illness, and I think, or their situation at that time, and I think that's very important to understand how the young adults or the families are explaining their issues, um, to try to understand. But I also, how I like using the words that they use, I also like correcting them when when the words they are using are have like a negative connotation, like how Kristine was saying, like the terms loco, loca. I mean, that's when I am like, well, let's stop using those words, because that's not helping anybody. And sometimes I see that from the family more than the young adults, right? Like the mother or the father having those expressions, and that can have like a negative effect on
And
the child.
and to add one more thing, Juan, I think this is not just us as people who work with young adults or families. I think that community, I think that there is a systematic issue where people who are unaware of mental health treat it like, if you have mental health issues, then you're different. And I think we need to normalize that and make sure that young adults feel okay with talking about their struggles. I think, maybe some rates of suicide will diminish if we talk more about it and make sure that it's normalized.
No, and I think with both of your comments, and I'm gonna make sure I get to every comment happening right now. I'm loving what I'm seeing in the chat. Thank you, everybody. When it comes to the topic of resilience, it's very important that we recognize that if we had like a circle, right? A lot of times that youth and young adult is right there in the middle, and we can have the best intentions. The youth and young adult can be aware of, I want to talk about mental health, but maybe it is still a process in their community. And when it comes to resilience, the fact that they are aware, or they can be aware, that culture doesn't change overnight, right? I was a person that was morbidly obese, for example. I was very overweight, and that led to a lot of challenges in my life. And even though I recognized the changes that I needed to do, it didn't exactly happen overnight. And when I recognized that this is a sprint, not a race for me, right? Because recovery is completely individual. It allowed me to understand that changes happen but the changes are happening, right? And that a lot of times can be something when we validate to that youth and young adult that we recognize that maybe they say you're local because the family, maybe that is what they know. But we are here to have conversations in the community and the different spaces so that can slowly but surely begin to shift. And getting to everybody's comments, Laura Smith wrote, there's still too much stigma with mental health. Martha writes, I think of it as having confidence in myself that I can handle it and grow when it comes to the topic of resilience. Teresa, regarding that stigma about mental health rights, because you're not supposed to air your dirty laundry or admit that there might be a problem. A lot of times, Teresa, and I would love to know everybody's feedback about this. You know, we were actually talking about this before we went live, is that we can sometimes fall on the topic of invalidation. Say that youth and young adults, specifically in the Latinx community, is finally opening up about an emotional challenge. Maybe the caregiver, somebody can say, yo pasé por algo peor, or yo resolví eso. Oh, I went through that. And we don't realize that indirectly, we may be telling that youth and young adult, I went through that, get over it, as opposed to, hey, let's actually have a conversation of how I got over it. And maybe that could be of help to you. Martha also writes, so true, there's still so much stigma, but hoping that younger people might be able to break down those stigmas. And that is why it's important that this is like a brainstorming, right? Everybody, as you're here, think about how you can create these very same spaces within your communities, because that way, not only do you get the youth and young adult involved, you also get other members of the community that maybe before would not really get involved in these conversations to be part of the experience. Holland writes, validating the mentoring experience that Kristine commented earlier. Jenica writes, I think resilience means understanding that you can't control your current circumstances, but choose to direct your attention otherwise, focusing on the breakthrough, not about overcoming, but what you need to be in that moment. And that's very important. It's like becoming self-aware that like what's happening right now, right? And what steps are taking place. And it's becoming self-aware that this is part of a bigger picture, right? That sooner or eventually we're going to be able to have these more broader conversations. We're having these conversations right now, right? Which is excellent.
Yeah.
Kristine.
And want to add is taking that, like what she said, that breakthrough, and teaching other people, educating other people, and sharing that experience where, you know, I've been through that, taking that, ripping that painful bandage off and saying, hey, I made it through, and how are we going to support other young adults, other families that might be struggling with sharing that experience. So that's a really good point.
That is an excellent point. And Jackie also wrote something that a few people in chat also agree with. I also believe individual generational cultural values come into play. Some cultures have other names and labels for mental health issues, insert religious beliefs as well. What's really important for this is that, for example, in my community, saying, tú estás loco, o te hospitalizaron, here it was a joke many years, like, oh, you're feeling not great, oh, you're going to be hospitalized, and it was seen as a joke. So it affected me as a child, because when I had to be hospitalized, everybody thought I was joking. I was like, no, I actually was hospitalized. But because it became a joking topic, nobody understood that, hey, that actually implies that I need to make changes in my life. I'm opening up because I want you to be part of my support system. And sometimes we can fall under that invalidation. Carolina writes, and I'm loving the chat, by the way. I'm trying to keep up with everybody. And Andrea and Kristine, as soon as I'm done with these, like, feel free to react first, and then we can carry over. But this is exactly what we wanted, people, so thank you. Carolina writes, I also believe that there is a fear that going to therapy can have repercussions for the family due to different parenting practices. Is child services going to get involved? Are we legally in the country, and will this affect us? I would actually like to pause right here, because this is a very sensitive topic that I feel a lot of us have had experiences, clinical or not, with families. So Andrea, in your case, what is your take on this? There's this sometimes lingering fear that even though it can be beneficial to seek therapy or any kind of support services, clinical or not, it can be like almost admitting there's a problem, right? Due to lack of education of what that process is like. How do you think we can begin to have these conversations so families know that it is not a threat, right? We're here for the benefit. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I agree with that, Juan. There is so much fear and many layers that actually contribute to that fear. That fear is real. One thing is being afraid that, oh, I go to therapy, so maybe I am not able to take care of my children. I have a mental illness and they are going to remove them from me. So I want to hide this mental illness. I don't want anybody to know that I take medication. I even have some patients that, for example, they prefer their mental health medications to be sent to one pharmacy because they receive the other medical medications in one pharmacy, and they don't want the pharmacist to know that they are taking mental health medications. I mean, like, what? And I asked them, like, but who is the pharmacist to you? You know, like, I mean, and they are like, well, they have seen me for years, and I don't want them to know that I take an antidepressant. And that's the level of stigma. And if it goes to that place, I mean, there's a lot of fear, but then I think that there has to be a lot of education and letting them know that mental illness is an illness as how is diabetes, or how is like COPD, that sometimes can be even more limiting, and give them the resources that they might need, right? There are so many parenting resources that they can use and have them helpful for the needs that they are having. And talking about the fear, the other layers of fear that I think it's in the question is if they are legal in the country, how that's going to affect. We see at the Hispanic clinic, probably half of the patients that we see, they don't have documents, and that's a lot of fear. When they seek treatment, they are afraid we're going to ask them for social security or stuff like that, and there has to be a lot of education to let them know that it's a safe space, that they can share things like that, and that it's going to be confidential. However, you know, the political situation these last years has made this a little bit more challenging to reassure them, because, you know, what we have been seeing of like ICE getting into hospitals and stuff like that. But those are fears that are real and actually affect how people seek mental health care.
No, and thank you for sharing that. And I think a lot of times it is that lingering fear. I remember in the systems of care here, a lot of specifically fathers would often not go to the services if it was their daughter going in, because their fear was, if my daughter says there's something wrong with her emotionally, for example, the concern would be, well, maybe they think I physically abused my daughter or something, right? Because sometimes we don't know. So we began educating the caregivers about what is therapy, what is therapy not, because I think sometimes we base things off, you know, it's like there's like the word on the street, right? The word on the street is, if you go to therapy, they're going to ask you these very specific questions. And when you're able to address that before they go in, to understand that there is a benefit, right? So I think one of the most healing things we can have, whether it be for the youth and young adult or the caregiver, is what is the benefit of therapy? Because that way they go in with the mindset that I'm going here not to fix a problem. I'm going here to empower myself, to become aware of the situation that is happening. In your case, Kristine, would you like to share some experiences or
Yeah.
things related to what Jackie mentioned?
So what I experience in the drop-in center with young adults is um, parents who are legal but are, you know, background of being immigrants but are now are legal, and having jobs, having private insurance, and not giving the tools to the young adult. The young adult's voicing that they want to see a therapist, but because the parent is not willing to give the young adult his insurance card or whatever, there's a lot of barriers with us being able to even help the young adult find a therapist, because the parents are not willing to, not because they're not educated, because of the fear of, well, now if you go to therapy and you say there's something wrong, then DCF or social services is going to come and take you. So even with us trying to educate some of the parents, it's a hard thing to have to go through. I give that to them, and I think that's another thing. I think we need to get better at educating people who are immigrants in mental health.
And that can be part of the conversation. A lot of you, before we even began having this forum today, you had sent us some emails about some common themes or topics that you would love all of us to discuss. And one of them, one of the specific comments was, "A mí me pegaron y yo salí bien." In English, translating to, "Oh, I was hit as a child, right? But I turned out okay." And it's understanding that, we're still going through a lot of changes in our community. And sometimes a lot of parents, for example, I remember I once facilitated a support group in Atlanta, Georgia, and these parents were there illegally, right? They were undocumented in the United States, and another family was legal. And both families had the same challenge, which is regardless of legal or not, the implications of a Latinx community family going to a therapist and going there was admitting that there was a problem in that household. So we realized the problem is not getting to the services, but how the services get to them, right? So we shifted the mindset of, instead of you coming to us, how can we come to you? With the purpose of education. I'm not here to fix anything. I'm not here to even give therapy. I'm here to clarify all these misconceptions that you could have, because sometimes our culture includes therapy as a once again an admittance that there can be that challenge there. So getting to a couple more comments here. Martha writes, "Some don't see those things as a disorder or an issue, or may have a different way of seeing it, like in some religions." And it can be part of like a very individualized process, right? Where maybe you can have an empowered caregiver that all of a sudden they can become they can have a lot of family members with very opposing opinions, and that caregiver can be very overwhelmed with all of this information coming in. And I can have the best intentions, but I can be drained. I can burn out in that process. The taboo may come from mental health being heard as sick in the mind, something that's unseen and scary, writes Elizabeth. Martha writes, "Some of that seems like European models of what mental illness is affecting the way that others' cultures see those challenges." And I think that in itself is why we're having these conversations, because mental health stigma exists in almost any community, but it is how, and it is specifically how does it affect the Latinx youth and young adult population, right? And not just recognizing, but what can we really do about it? And I actually want to get to a question that I saw here, comes to us from Holland. Can you also speak to how Latinx community supports resiliency? What are some of the strengths? Sorry, the chat moved up. What are some of the strengths the culture brings that promote positive outcomes? We were actually speaking, the three of us, before it even began, so we could even start with that, where right now, being very culturally aware, we understand that a lot of things happening related to COVID, et cetera. Families are maybe more at home, maybe they're more connected. And in one side of the fence, it could be perceived as a challenge, right? Where it's like, how do we talk about this? But I would like to start it off with Kristine. What are some of the opportunities within the very Latinx population, maybe within that context of the family? What are some of the opportunities to begin to promote that positive outcome regarding mental health?
I think a lot of education for us, and it's part of what I do on a daily basis with our young adults, educating them in their language, in a way they understand, in a very like Andrea was saying earlier, like if the family wants to say, "I'm a little bit sad," and okay, so let's go where you're at. Let's meet you there, um, and let's go from there. I think those are ways that obviously we can support all these young adults. I think that's a way that in our community we're trying to. My organization as a whole is just trying to support all these Latinx families in understanding um, the educational piece of mental health. Um, and then I think that's like talking their language is a strength that we bring, and making sure that you're not talking about the diagnosis and the full name that they're not going to understand and all these additional wording. I think, just bringing it down, and not bringing it down, bringing it to their language. I don't want to say that we're bringing it down to anybody, but bringing it to their language and a language that they would understand as a way to support their resiliency. That would be my answer.
No, and that's an excellent point, because we need to be aware that a lot of us here, we could have peer specialists, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, people with knowledge and experience. So, we can talk about evidence-based practices, and we can talk about motivational interviewing. But when we talk to the family, we say in Spanish, en arroz habichuela. I went to a lot of families that the moment they heard a lot of like big words, to be like, en arroz habichuela, Juan, ¿qué es lo que tú me quieres decir? So it's like in the simplest way possible, how can we really connect with the purpose and the reason that we are here? In your case, Andrea, what are your thoughts on this part?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I wanted to add to the question that Holland was asking. I think Maria Elvira replied briefly to that. Like, what are the cultural things that we can do to build resilience in families? And actually, so there's some cultural values that are part of the Latinx culture, and the most important one is the family, right? That the family support, how united and supportive a family can be. Usually, like, the families are big and extended, and everybody tries to help each other, and they feel it's a responsibility, right? Like, to be for one another and to help around, to guide the younger ones, to respect the older ones. And that's one of the values that actually can help, like, in resilience, in recovery. And we should encourage Latino families to keep them, right? To continue developing them. Some of them, they come here to the United States, and then they lose a little bit of that, maybe because the family is away, or maybe because they start seeing that the society maybe acts in a different way, but continue the family support. And then Maria Elvira also mentioned personalism, which is like seeing another people as their individual value, and confianza, right? Like trusting each other as people, trusting more in the person than in the institution. So trusting more like in the therapist rather than in the whole hospital. And I think those things, those factors can improve resilience. And I like seeing that as like a family can be resilient, right? Like not only the young adult, not only the parents, but the family as a whole can learn how to be resilient and move on through the challenges.
And I think one of the beautiful opportunities with both of you mentioned is, for example, here in Puerto Rico, Hurricane Maria is obviously the most obvious example of an event that changes everything. We always said that it didn't matter if you had $1 or $1 million, because temporarily you had access to literally nothing, So that actually presented a challenge, but an opportunity, which is you had a lot of people that saw mental health as eres loco, you're the crazy person, we don't talk about that. People were experiencing severe anxiety, and rightfully so. So it created a safe space within communities to finally talk about these things that we had historically not talked about, because maybe I couldn't associate with somebody that went through severe depression, but because there was a like-minded event. And right now with what's happening with COVID, for example, and all of you can figure out within your communities, is there a common event that multiple people from multiple cultures can identify with, just for the purpose of looking for this connection? Because once we bond, once we were able to connect, we can have more real and genuine conversations about this. So it's always identifying, maybe I didn't go through what Andrea, as an example, went through, but maybe I can relate to those emotions that you're feeling because I went through something similar. And when you can actually speak about this within your family, maybe that family member doesn't know what it's like to be living with, generalized anxiety, but they can have this lingering fear of things, and that affected them. And I can connect with that. So it's looking at those opportunities for connection. Two comments here. Erika writes, also, all culture sometimes prevents us from seeking help. Also, admitting there is an issue is hard for some of us due to our traditions or cultures. We should have this parental nature, she writes in quotes. When there is an issue or need for treatment, it can be hard to communicate with our family. And that sort of goes back to something we have indirectly maybe addressed, which is we sometimes talk about a traditional household as in, youth or young adult or a caregiver. But a lot of times in the context of a Latinx family, we have the extended family, and they don't necessarily have to be even in the same state. You know, you can call a family member, and this happened to me, for example, where it was, hey, Juan has X or Y diagnosis. ¿Qué tiene que? All you got to do is hit him once or twice and it's going to go away. That's just like, that's the psychiatrist looking for money. That's what people told with my mother. So sometimes that caregiver has this pressure from everybody, that everybody feels like an expert, right? But education, I think, is the thing that we're talking about. How can we educate more so than right or wrong? How can we provide these materials and resources for the community? Elizabeth has a really good question, which is, when you talk about misconceptions that our culture carries, I'm wondering how aware we really are of them. Can you actually name some of them? We've sort of talked about, you know, stigma, traditions, cultures, and sometimes within the context of it affecting mental health. Is there an example that one of you two can think of that it is something happening in our culture? I remember when I was hospitalized, for example, my main language, even though I'm fully bilingual, I felt more comfortable speaking emotionally in Spanish. But when I spoke in Spanish, one of the nurses, with the best intentions, said, "Oh, Juan, like Spanish is so exotic." And my reaction was, that's just how I speak. And I felt like I was like a new kid in the block. I felt like I was like the new toy, like, Juan, speak in Spanish. And I felt like I was being devalued. And sometimes we can do that with the mindset of embracing you. But we don't realize that within that, there's a lot of this implication that you're different from what I am. Like, I'm just speaking the language that I speak. You know, I don't speak Spanish with the mindset of speaking exotic or speaking not English, right? But that's just an example on a personal experience. What about Christina?
So Elizabeth,
Christine?
I'm not sure if this is going to answer your question, but just let me know in the chat. So I am Puerto Rican. My first language is Spanish. My husband's Puerto Rican, and I chosen to see a non-Puerto Rican therapist because in my misconception, I feel like my culture, and this is my opinion, can be a little bit judgmental. So I've chosen to see a therapist that's away from my culture because I don't want to feel in therapy like I have to be careful with what I say because they might judge. So I think that's a misconception that I carry as my own culture, and that can be my own biases. But it's just an example that I think I wanted to share, a personal example of my bias in my culture. And let me know if I answered your question that helped.
That's an excellent point, though, because sometimes we can assume that I'm Puerto Rican. I physically look Puerto Rican. My name is Juan, right? So somebody externally could just say Juan wants a male Puerto Rican psychologist, right? But then maybe my culture is actually part of what has affected me, because when I thought about, and this happened with me, so I validate what happened with Kristine. I felt more associated with a female white psychologist because I grew up with an abusive father, right? My family wouldn't accept. So the last thing I wanted for me as a child and an adolescent was to engage with somebody that reminded me of my culture. But that's not to say that is happening with everybody, but it is the importance of directly asking that youth or young adult, who do you feel most comfortable with and why? In your case, Andrea, any comments about this?
Yeah, yeah, I think it's a great question that Elizabeth is bringing up. What was coming to my head instantly was like all these feelings of guilt or fault that come to a lot of people when we talk about mental illness, right? If a child has a mental illness or any problem, then we start we start hearing from the parents, what did I do wrong, or like uh, what I could have done to prevent this, and then they feel very guilty about it. Or maybe the same person having a mental illness feeling guilty that they are not able to, I don't know, overcome what's happening without feeling sad or depressed, or why is they feeling so anxious, is their fault and they have something wrong. So I think all those are misconceptions that we need to educate people and um, let them know that it's not their fault, it's not something that they have wrong in their heads, right? That they're not that they're not incomplete. Or I have heard many terms that are really sad, how people describe themselves when they think they have a mental illness. Another misconception that I see a lot is thinking, and I think Juan, you mentioned that having mental illness is the end of life, right? Like, then I'm not gonna be able to do anything. What's going to happen? Like, if it's a child, like, they're not gonna be able to finish school or get married or have a job, and we need to let them know that they can achieve all those goals. Maybe they're gonna need a little bit more help on the way, but they're gonna be able to do what they want to do. And other misconception that I see a lot is about medications. Like, if you have mental illness and you don't take medications, then it's kind of like, okay, maybe I can deal with that. But then taking medication means like, oh, I'm really sick and this is really, really bad, right? Or the medications are gonna be addictive and I won't be able to be without medications, never ever. And that's also a misconception, right? Like, most of the mental health medications are not addictive, and actually what people tend to get in the streets, that's what's addictive. So those are misconceptions that were coming to my head while I was reading that question.
No, and you bring up some incredible points, and based on that, I'm actually going to bring up an open question. And those that identify with this question, or specifically families that you've supported, you can respond with one. For example, you can just type one in chat. When Andrea said, X or Y caregiver, when they found out their adolescent, young adult was diagnosed, I did something wrong. Have you had experiences where that parent, for better or worse, feels like, I did something wrong, I'm the problem, what did I do? Was what I ate, was this like a family existence? Because it happens a lot, and it goes back to that lingering fear that we sometimes have because of the implications in the community. Sometimes we've had experiences with youth and young adult that become completely separated from their family because at the fear of somebody recognizing that they have a mental illness, they're perceived as different. So we'll just remove them from the equation, right? And that leads to a lot of loneliness, depression. That's where we talk about suicidality, right? It's all of these things because we sometimes identify that because it is a problem. But like what I believe Andrea mentioned earlier, we can have the best intentions of providing services, clinical or not, right? I provide peer support services. So a lot of times when I have youth and young adult come over to me, they'll have years of trauma, not even related to their mental illness. It is the trauma of, after being diagnosed, everything that came with that: bullying, family's negative comments, eres el bruto, you're the dumb one of the family, you're going to be irrelevant, you can't do this, you can do that. So when I sit there and I'm able to just share my experiences with the mindset that, hey, I know what that's like, but look at me now, right? I'm a proud person, a suicide survivor. I'm able to do this. I'm able to provide what? Hope. Lo que es esperanza, what is hope sometimes, is what a lot of these families need, because we can't solve the problems overnight, right? But we can instill that hope so the families know, hey, you know what? It is worth continuing forward. Jenica writes here, I think it's especially difficult for my students whom grew up identifying as and presenting as Latinx, but having that culture stripped from them because of their white parents and or not having access to the language or culture. It causes a lot of disassociation, which sends them even further down the path with mental health issues. This then causes Latinx peers to disassociate with them as well, as saying things like, you're not actually Puerto Rican, insert Latinx identity here. How do we support this reconnecting and peer-to-peer acceptance? So to paraphrase, Jenica also brings up this challenge of, in order to be considered part of the Latinx community, you kind of have to check off a few boxes, right? And sometimes that can be a challenge because you have your mental illness, right, which we're trying to manage. You have your family, but then you have people in the community that could be like, you're even like, you look the same way, right? Sometimes we even have similar last names, but you speak differently or you eat differently. Therefore, you're not necessarily. Would you say, when it comes to the topic of resilience, what is something that we can do to begin to strengthen this effort, focusing on the possible outcomes of how can we educate communities to to become aware that being Latinx doesn't mean que yo como arroz, habichuela y pollo, right? It doesn't mean that I have to listen to a certain music. I am who I am, and I don't change that. But how can we begin having these conversations for the benefit of youth and young adults within the Latinx community? Either one of you have a comment about that?
I think embracing, yeah, again, I think I keep repeating the educational piece, but I think it's so important to educate. I think, you know, it seems like Jenica, if I'm correct, you work in a school, maybe, but potentially starting with the parents and starting, okay, so you said yes. So teaching the parents of getting together, maybe, I don't know if the school does any cultural things for the parents, you know, like I recently heard a group of Hispanos Unidos, right? And it's just a group of young adults who meet together to talk about Hispanic stuff. Like Juan said, not every Hispanic person eats arroz y habichuela y pollo. So, you know, let's start with the parents, and I think that would potentially, and I'm not saying that's going to fix the issue, but potentially teach the kids of, okay, I am Puerto Rican. That doesn't mean I've had to visit. My kids are Puerto Ricans, right? They associate as being Puerto Rican. They've never been to Puerto Rico. So I think teaching the parents to teach their kids those values, and it's hard, and I give it to you, Jenica, asking those questions, because it's hard as a provider to teach these kids their culture, because I'm assuming you have a classroom full of different cultures within a culture. So I give it to you.
Andrea, in your case, carrying the conversation, because it is like a lot of times this is a very difficult thing to answer, because, you know, she mentioned a Puerto Rican person as an example, but this can be Colombian, Venezuelan, like, and each one is individual. What are some possibilities, right, to begin to support these efforts of just embracing, you know, that culture and those values?
Yeah, I think is very complex and complicated, and I really appreciate Janika asking these questions, because I mean it's difficult, right? We have to think about and I'm talking more from the point of immigrants. When immigrants decide to migrate, they go through a lot of challenges and issues that they learn to overcome, and they are very resilient. They have reasons to move from one country to the other. They find the ways to solve struggles and problems. But then they have children in the new country, right? Like, and then these children, they don't have as much as, like, for example, the extended family support that the first like that the immigrants had, or they didn't have the reasons to immigrate, right? Like they were just born in this new country, and those factors actually have like some consequences in the it would be like the children of the immigrants, right? Because they don't have all the tools. So then a lot of education has to happen, like how Kristine is saying. Then these children will have to learn about the culture from their parents. It's not gonna come implicit, right? It comes to us, right? Like I grew up in Peru, and nobody taught me how to be Peruvian. I mean, that's how I was, because of I was living there. Um, but then these children are going to need to learn through their parents.
No, and thank you for mentioning that. And I think going back to what you've brought up there, and also Kristine, is more so than the culture, it's the value behind that culture, right? It's recognizing it's not about the arroz en habichuelas, it's not about the language, is what is the value behind that? What is the feeling behind all of that? I, for example, I can move from Puerto Rico to Massachusetts, to New Hampshire, to anywhere around the world. And is my environment going to change? Absolutely, right? I can't sit here and pretend that it's going to be just taking everything from Puerto Rico and moving it elsewhere. But I can bring my values behind that and recontextualize and consider the fact that I'm in a new environment. How can I apply my values, and what are the activities that have similar values here? I can I can become intrigued by, I celebrate things a certain way. How do they celebrate things a certain way? And that concept of like being curious about that cultural diversity can be something that is very healing. We've had a lot of families, for example, from Puerto Rico have to move, for example, after Hurricane Maria, right? So they're moving because of all these things that are happening. They moved across all of the United States, like all that data is there, right? So we were preparing these families. That's like, yeah, there are going to be changes. There's going to be multiple languages. There's not just going to be Spanish, because a Mexican, Puerto Rican, Colombian, Venezuelan, and everybody else do not speak Spanish the exact same way. But when you know the intention behind all of that, when you understand the values and the diversity and embrace it, as opposed to live in that lingering fear, families can see that as that opportunity, and they can develop new friends. A lot of times it develops that loneliness, right, for them, but it's like, how do I identify with somebody that doesn't necessarily look, walk, or talk like me, but it can present an opportunity for that. We have a couple of comments here, and I really do want to thank everybody for the conversation, because this is exactly what we wanted. We didn't want to have the guiding thing that Andrea, Kristine, and Juan think this is the conversation to have. So as Kristine wrote in chat, thank you, Jenica, because sometimes these are undoubtedly uncomfortable conversations, because the topic in itself is uncomfortable, right? We're all trying to figure out what is a challenge, and not just Puerto Rico, not just, Massachusetts. This is happening all around the world. And sometimes, writes Carolina, we are the only ones representing our culture here in the USA. And it is hard when your child is exposed more to the North American culture. And I think that is something that is very important, that we just have these conversations and be aware, just be aware that it is different, and just sort of asking ourselves, what can we do with that, right? Which is very important. Maria, responding to Jenica, writes, and that is why educating about hope, recovery, and resilience is so important. Thanks for sharing. I understand. I think the best example is when everybody here, think about your first day on the job, whatever job it is, first day of college even. It can be very intimidating, right? Because you're walking into a classroom and then you're figuring out where you're going to sit. Is there anybody that's dressed like you, right? Is there anybody that looks like you? Is there anybody that's laughing or not that could be aligned? We're having all these questions, right? But let's put that into the context of somebody within the Latinx community that could also have other challenges. Like, is there, as Carolina wrote, what if nobody looks like me, right? I can be intimidated. And even though everybody can have the best of intentions, because of prior, possibly negative experiences, we can feel overwhelmed and we leave the classroom. We leave the therapist office. Imagine I walk into a place and nobody looks like me. They can be providing the best services. And this is not a generalization. This is some of the experiences, definitely not all of them, but it begs the question of how can we begin to develop culturally aware safe spaces within these different environments, so people know that, hey, maybe I don't identify with your culture, maybe I don't understand, and that's okay. We are here to sit with you and learn about that. So that's actually going to be a question I want to bring first to Andrea. We've talked a lot about the community. So speaking a little bit about what can providers do to become not just self-aware, but maybe create that opportunity that maybe I'm not a Latinx representative, right? Maybe I don't identify as Latinx, but here I am providing the services. What are some of the things that I could do to create a welcoming environment for that youth or young adult?
Yeah, that's a very important question, Juan. And mainly because we don't have enough Hispanic mental health professionals giving services. So there are going to be many Latinx young adults or parents or kids that are going to be receiving services from somebody who do not identify as Latino. And as I'm saying, that can be a little bit challenging, because we have seen that there are better outcomes when actually the patients are matched with somebody from their own culture. But that doesn't mean that they cannot receive services, right? Like, and that the services are not going to be good. The services can be very good. But then the professionals, the mental health professionals, they will need to build an environment that is welcoming, that is going to let the parents or the kids or the young adults express themselves the best way. I have worked, for example, with refugees, and we never had like all the languages, for example, that we needed, but we always had interpreters. It's not the best thing to do. It's better to speak in the same language, but there are ways to do it in a way that it can be successful, right? To train very well interpreters that can help, or to provide community resources for those families. Maybe they're going to receive mental health services from a non-Latino provider, but they can get related to a group of parents from the same community that is going through something similar, or for the kids to join a group of other young adults that are, I don't know, doing other activities like singing or acting or music, sports, or also link them with religious services that can be in their language, which is usually very important in the Latino community. So opening those resources for them can also be very welcoming. And also accepting the limitations, right? Like accepting and saying like, well, you know, maybe I'm not Hispanic, I'm not Latino, but I want to learn more about your culture and I want to help you in the best way I can. And that can also help the relationship to move in a successful way.
And in your case, Christina, and thank you for that, Andrea. Do you agree with what Andrea is mentioning here and have other aspects as well?
Yeah, I do, and I also wanted to add, you know, we talked about allies, and you know, people who want to do the work that are necessarily not of the culture. I think also being open, you know, open to sharing your experiences and teaching others. It's like, you know, I was doing a racial training this morning, and they mentioned like talking to whites or blacks or Puerto Ricans or about your racial experiences, but also about your mental health experiences and your resiliency, and you know, talking to people about these things I think are really important. I was reading Jenica's comment, and she said that 33% of her students are of color, and it's overwhelming for her to have to figure this out. My heart goes to you because it's really hard when you potentially and a few others are the only people in that school. My thought initially was, well, get together with the few people that are there and, you know, make a movement, you know, show the rest of the school that there is potential. There, you know, I'm white or I'm not Puerto Rican enough or I'm not this enough. They have value. So, you know, maybe teaching these kids the value of like, okay, let's do a group of blacks or Puerto Ricans or Hispanic, let's say Hispanic, Latinx people, to show the rest of the school that they are valuable. I think education, I think sharing experience, I think as providers to a community, knowing our own biases, I think it's a good start too, because obviously we all have biases in cultures and in experiences. So knowing that, so when someone's talking to you about their experience, you don't automatically put your bias first. I think it's my advice to kind of how to support community members on doing this, and people and young adults and stuff.
And those are both some excellent points. So thank you to both Christina and Andrea. And actually elaborating on that very comment that Jenica wrote, I am one of the only faculty of color and a few Latinx folks in the school. Sometimes it feels like tokenizing as I serve to guide and lead on the school's PTO, diversity and committee, etc. We have only 33% students of color, and it can feel overwhelming trying to figure out how to properly address these things and from proper angles. And I saw the word challenging because I think a lot of us that have been in the Latinx community have at some point or other been the Latino in the room, right? Where sometimes maybe they're not even aware why, as opposed to just, well, we kind of need some diversity. So here's Juan, or here's, you know, insert person here, without considering whenever you put somebody that is different, you know, for better or worse in a new room, you have to consider, do I need to make some changes to create a welcoming environment for those people? A lot of times we combine this with youth and young adults who are a very challenging population to include in committees, because more often than not, we sometimes don't even have like a lot of roles, or maybe not be clear. I had a call last week where somebody was asking me, Juan, we want to include some youth. to bring up some ideas, but we're afraid of some controversy. And when I ask, what do you mean controversy? Is what if the youth brings up something that they're in a disagreement with? Then my answer was, well, what are you going to do about it? Because if you want to empower youth, give them forum so they can speak out. It's not about listening. It's about listening, engaging, validating, and acting upon it, right? So I think before we even contemplate including more people or including people within the Latinx community, youth and young adults, we need to have a conversation internally with our own staff, as Kristine mentioned, and recognize our biases. Recognize that maybe we have things that we're not necessarily aware about, and that's okay, because that is what those safe spaces are. We all have our biases because we all grow up in individual communities, but let's not forget that, as I mentioned before, and Andrea and Kristine have done an excellent job at talking about this, our families have a history of trauma, that youth and young adult have a history of trauma. Therefore, we can't be surprised when they're very defensive sometimes, because maybe you're the 15th provider that is asking the same question, asking where they come from, and they're tired of it. They're exhausted. You know, how many times do we forget about mental health? We go to any kind of service and we get asked the same questions, and we find that intrusive. We find that, quite frankly, boring sometimes. So it's, how do we create that environment, that trauma-informed environment, where I contemplate that trauma in not just that family, but in that overall community? Do I need to change the language? Do I need to change where those meetings take place, how those meetings are facilitated? How can I incentivize those families? And incentivize doesn't mean money. Incentivize means, what is my benefit? What can I get out of this, right? How can I create that environment there? Jackie writes, I agree. Once the family slash Latinx person has found something, someplace, or someone they can identify with, it changes their perspectives dramatically. Now, Andrea, do you have any comments about
Yeah.
either the comment in the chat or what I mentioned before?
Yeah, what you mentioned before, Han, is so powerful what you're saying. And I think to Janica's point, I mean, I think we cannot just ignore what's going on outside in the world and all these recent and multiple killings and shootings that are going on. And those are um, unfortunate events that our youth, our kids are watching, right? And they're seeing, and sometimes they see themselves on those persons that are being attacked or shoot. And um, the problem is big, right? It's not only at school or at a community, at a family, at a city. Is a problem that is happening in the world. And I think, as you're saying, Juan, having the conversation in a safe space is a good starting point. Talking about it, talking about like how we are all different, but that's fine. And that diversity actually brings more to the table, and that we should embrace diversity instead of like putting it down. So having those conversations are actually very helpful. And I know they're hard to have. I mean, I have seen myself in situations where I'm like, oh, I don't want to have this conversation, you know, I would prefer to skip it or something. But having those conversations can actually create a better society.
Absolutely. And looking at some of the questions that all of you sent throughout the email, you know, even though we've talked about mental illness in a general sense, obviously there's one topic that's even more sensitive within that, which is the concept of suicidality or suicide, right? Where, let's consider the fact that already when we bring up mental illness, I say jokingly sometimes, I feel like the lights change when you bring up mental illness, right? It's a different environment. Sometimes people even change the tone of their voice. But when we even get to the topic of suicide, and sometimes even if that youth or young adult hasn't even had the thought, even the fact that we should maybe or can maybe talk about this with caregivers, we understand that concern, right, of what could happen afterwards. How challenging, and this is an open question for everybody in chat and for both Kristine and Andrea, how challenging within the Latinx community can it be to have even just a basic conversation about the topic of suicide? And if so, what do you think is maybe the biggest factor that makes it such a challenge? And I know it's a heavy question.
It is.
we're aware.
I guess I'm muted.
Oh, there we go. Yeah.
Oh, there we go. It is a very heavy question. Um, I think that, you know, I have had incidents where young adults have shared um, their thoughts of suicidal, but I think it's just we haven't been educated enough on what to say, how to ask. I mean, I in my experience, I'm not a clinical person, um, and it's like, what do you? How do you support? How do you help? You know, it's a lot. I don't even know.
No, and that's exactly part of it. You know, Teresa writes in chat, I think religious beliefs may sometimes make it a hard topic of discussion. And obviously, we know that even just bringing this topic up can sometimes be uncomfortable. But let's not forget that the whole concept of this conversation is resilience, right? But to be able to build that resiliency, sometimes if we are uncomfortable to have the uncomfortable conversations, that young person that is going through it ends up feeling alone. Whereas when we build that community that makes it okay to have these conversations, that it's not about whether you live or the opposite happens. It's the fact that you can have that conversation and that young person can say, wow, they're actually listening to me, right? And that can make it a welcoming experience. In your case, Andrea, with your experience here, what would you have to say about this topic?
Yeah, very challenging question, Juan. Thank you for asking that. But yeah, I agree with that completely. And that goes to the point of misconception, right? There's this big misconception that talking about suicide is actually worse and it's going to put ideas in the people that now that you have mentioned suicide, then people are going to have that as an option. And that's not true, right? It's the other way, actually opening the space for them to talk about these thoughts that are more common than what we think. Actually, many people experience ideas of like not wanting to live anymore or like tired of life or things like that. Sometimes we joke about, but sometimes behind those jokes there's some real thoughts of despair and hopeless. uh, but as I think Teresa was saying, religious beliefs makes them like you can't feel suicide, you know, because it would be very wrong if you actually feel suicidal. That would be like very bad. So then people try to suppress them and not to think that way when actually those thoughts are already there. I have had like families hiding suicide from family members, so like through generations, right? Like they died from like an illness or something happened when actually it was a suicide. Um, and those are points that are very difficult to bring up in a family dynamic where they think they're trying to protect each other, because it's very difficult to talk about and accept that somebody actually killed themselves.
And we have two comments in chat about this. So Martha writes, that makes a lot of sense. Those conversations carry a lot of stigma, but what maybe we can model how to bring it up and talk about it. Do you have a plan, etc.? Helps show empathy and listening. Martha writes, that's such an important point, Andrea. And GDR26 writes, alliance of therapeutic work is so important to create relationships and quality of time because it allows clients to experience a special treatment and reciprocity, and must be the words that occurs frequently in the therapeutic setting to promote reciprocal truth relationships. And I want to go back to what Andrea was mentioning earlier, is that sometimes I've had experiences of suicide interventions in a non-clinical scenario, but sometimes I've been the person that the people have like felt open about, hey, I'm having these thoughts. When you explore, it is sometimes people think of suicide as the option or feel uncomfortable about it. But when you really explore, the person is tired of having all of these desires, aspirations, things that they want to achieve, but because of literally everything we've talked about today, people, imagine, put yourself in the shoes of the Latinx youth and young adult that is not Puerto Rican enough, not Mexican enough, or too Mexican so others can identify with. And the cultural changes, all of these different things that create barriers that the person is saying, like, I didn't get asked, what color I wanted to be, or what was my name going to be, or, which family I wanted to be when I grew up. Yet, despite that, I am being dealt with all of these challenges, regardless of what I actually choose to do. And that can lead to the loss of hope. That can lead to the loss of, well, if I'm trying and despite that, these things are happening, then I'm open about that. But that presents an opportunity. When a youth or a young adult wants to talk about this topic of suicide, as uncomfortable as it can be, it presents the chance that they want to live because they're speaking up about, hey, I don't want to do this, but I don't know what is the other option. That is where creating environments about alternatives to suicide. What are the reasons worth living? What are the safe spaces? Why is this happening? And what can we do around our community, especially in our schools? Right now, we talked about this, and I'd like to dedicate the remainder of the conversation or part of it to the COVID lifestyle now, where we're dealing with all these challenges, where maybe in some of you in some state schools are, thinking Spanish right now, or local, some are online, some are mixed, right? And this can present a lot of different challenges, but creating these opportunities just for dialogue, for validation, can let them know that there's an opportunity here, and we can choose to accept and embrace that. Which leads to a question for everybody. Let's think about all of these things that could either strengthen or challenge resiliency within Latinx youth and young adults. And then let's bring it up to August 2020, where many people, right, since the month of March, estimated dependently, have had all of these other challenges being provided. What are some of the opportunities that maybe families can have to talk about mental illness where before they maybe were too afraid to? The fact that we're all connected online can present many different opportunities. So whether it be Andrea, Kristine, or somebody else, I would love to know, with the bigger dependency of technology, let's call it, right? How can we use this resource that we all have right now to build healthier communities that promote resilience for Latinx youth and young adults? Oh, Laura has a comment here writing, our schools have started a Hope Squad that is a student run to help prevent suicide and could be a great option for other schools. That right there is an excellent opportunity. Janica writes, anyone who would like to connect and collaborate, discuss these ideas further, please feel to find me on LinkedIn. There you go. You have the information right there. And I remember before we went live here, I think it was Kristine, uh, you and I were talking about the fact that, maybe some families would feel more comfortable about being educated even now, that I can be drinking my coffee, I can be sitting at home, as opposed to driving my car to this hospital facility, or place that says therapy, which people can look at that, and that carries a lot of baggage. Do you see that as some of the possibilities, creating more online environments for education?
I think that is a good point, Juan, that you reminded me of. I think that giving families, young adults, this opportunity, I think that's a good thing COVID has done. Giving families this opportunity to connect virtually, not having to go somewhere and, like you mentioned, feel embarrassed because now they're walking into the clinic. I think another point that Andrea talked about earlier was that some families are actually connecting more because now they're sharing their experiences, and they're relating to one another. I think those are things that um, are hopeful. They're connecting with their kids that at some point they weren't because they didn't have the time. So I think, during this time, I think more and more young adults are seeking support because they feel like now they don't have to drive or take the bus or feel embarrassed to go into a location.
No, thank you for that. And that is, one of the benefits. And it's also, we are aware that not everybody has a smartphone, and not just that, it's the combination of smartphone, but also having a decent enough signal. But it is another resource, right? That is another opportunity that could be of benefit. Valerie writes, thinking back to Juan's comments earlier about how the sheer trauma and stress related to the hurricanes in Puerto Rico helped to decrease some of the stigma associated with mental health struggles. I wonder if the shared experience of the pandemic may do the same. And that is a great opportunity. You know, you can all have these conversations within your Latinx community families and be like, how have you overcome all this? Like any family that as of August 27th, 2020 is still here, they have become more resilient than they probably were in February. And I think we all have, right? Many of us, when this maybe started happening, we weren't sure of our job opportunities or not, education or not. How are we going to celebrate birthdays, right? And does it change our culture? Without question. But Latinx families talking about resiliency have, before the pandemic, before Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, we've already had other challenges where we've had to adapt culturally, where we've had something that says like, hey, you got to make a modification. So it's an opportunity to also celebrate the recovery of these families that have overcome through all of that. Mariela also references Youth Mental Health First Aid as a great training resource. I know Youth ECPR is also another excellent resource that I think Massachusetts is doing some youth ECPR sessions. In your case, Andrea, uh, this online environment from a clinical perspective, right? What benefits have you seen of this cultural adaptation, if it could be called, right? Where all of a sudden, before it was a lot easier to speak about my emotions with you directly, but now, you know, it's a microphone or it's a camera. What opportunities does that present for you?
Yeah, I think it has been different for different people because I have some patients that they really appreciate the option of calling over the phone. They don't have to see me, so they feel a little bit more free to talk just by not seeing my face or me not seeing them. Or just by how Kristine was saying, they can just talk from anywhere. They don't have to go to the mental health center, you know, that has like this big title on the top, and it can be stigmatizing, right? So then but then there are also some limitations, right? Some patients, they don't have the internet, how you're saying. Some others, they don't have even the space to talk about when they are at home, right? Like I have some patients, they talk to me from the closet, right? Like literally they get inside the closet to have the session, or they get inside the car, or they just start walking around the block, just to be alone and have like a space where they can talk with privacy, right? But what I have seen also is that, and that goes to the point that Valerie was bringing, is how COVID has, I think, has worsened some mental illness in some people, also more anxiety, more depression, some PTSD, and that's also like an opportunity for people to reach for help, right? And having the availability of doing it online actually increases the access. So I think in certain way it has improved the access to care for most of the people. I know some community organizations or even the hospital they have also provided cell phones and data, and that has worked very well because they're given the opportunity to connect. But yeah, it's really challenging times that are changing and have changed how we deal with mental illness for sure.
Exactly. And it's important to recognize that diversity, that maybe for some people it presents an opportunity, for others it does present a challenge, right? I'll never forget, we're doing online support groups here in Puerto Rico, and in one of the first groups somebody said exactly what you're saying, Andrea, which is like, I never wanted to go to one of these facilities because it's like going there, parking, and it's like if a family member sees me, oh, but now I can log on, I'm like, here I am having lunch and I'm speaking to all of you. So let's embrace that, but also recognize that not everybody may feel as comfortable, but we can talk about the benefits. We can talk about, this is another resource. If it works for you, unbelievable. And if it doesn't, that's fine as well. Um, Maria writes, the New England MHTTC has a Latino initiative, so we would love to hear from you. So Maria has posted the information in chat. Also worth pointing is that in these last 10 minutes, if there are any general questions that all of you have regarding all of these things. We knew that going in, the hour and a half has flown by, right? And I think this is a conversation we could have for 5-6 hours. So if there's any additional questions, you can let us know. At the same time, there will be a recording sent within 24 hours after this online session, as well as the evaluation form. So it's very important for us that you do fill it out, because that way it lets us know, what could we improve upon, any recommendations. We understand that this is only beginning to open another door, right? Where this is not that we end this and it is like magically solved. We understand that. Jackie writes, our college started a support group to open up those conversations and address questions, especially the ones coming from a place of anxiety or COVID-centered stressors. A hot topic was the open air media and social media influences. And I would like to actually bring up the topic of social media, because it was something that was also brought up in the emails that were sent, which is, we're talking about the Latinx youth and young adult that sometimes may want to engage in social media, right? With the intent of, maybe I don't identify with somebody in my family going through a challenge, but maybe social media presents an opportunity, even as something as simple as a hashtag, right? I can connect with somebody from anywhere else. I can do hashtag mental health or mental illness, and I'm going to find some resource or somebody else maybe going through a related activity. How do you factor in social media based on your experiences? So there's no right or wrong answer here for everybody. Can social media be an element of a support system for that Latinx or in youth and young adult? And if so, how? This is a question for anybody, both in chat, all of you have many experiences, or Kristine or Andrea. When it comes to social media, what would you say is a possible benefit or one of the challenges that it could introduce within the pandemic for the population we're discussing?
I think one of the things that when I think about social media is the resources that it brings. Before we didn't have the amount of resources. I mean, now, like you mentioned, they have the hashtags, they have the groups that you can join, which, groups are some of the groups are people who have similar interests or want similar resources. So I think those are kind of some of the benefits that social media brings to our population. I think, some of the disadvantages is the fast, the way things can be shared so fast. So young adult does something stupid, it's shared in a matter of minutes. But I also think, there's a lot of more benefits to social media that I see that disadvantages, in my opinion.
And Andrea, in your perspective, how do you visualize social media within the current context?
I think it's a strong support community, but also if it's used in a good way, I think it can have I think Kamuna's was saying, pros and cons, right? I have seen a lot of people feeling bullied because of their ethnicity or their mental health issues, and if this resource is not used well, I think it can do more harm, actually. Also depends which social media or which networks people are joining. Sometimes people get into groups that are not the best ones, and so then I feel like there's need a lot of guidance. But I wanted to ask a question to the chat. It's not a question. It's a question homework. How do you take care of your own resilience, and how do you improve your own resilience while giving services to young adults, to families, parents, children? How do you take care of yourself while going through all this in this current situation? You don't have to answer, but you can think about that. And I think it's important because we have to take care of ourselves so we can take care of others as well.
And that is a very powerful point, because sometimes and when I say we, I mean all of us here in chat and all of your coworkers, we are sometimes tasked with the people that it is our job to build resilience for others, right? That is the expectation sometimes, where it's we are all human beings and we're all going through this, right? And it can be very exhausting. So self-care is key, and also recognizing and validating. And something I always talk about is strategic storytelling, which is when I share my story of resiliency, that can motivate somebody else in that process. I consulted this with Valerie. I also want to openly support, not sponsor anyway, but something that I've done with my lived experiences. I have a podcast, if anybody that's interested, called Happy to Fail. Uh, it is available on all podcast apps, even on Facebook, where, for example, I share my lived experience in a specific way with the hope of getting other people to have these conversations. So the same way that, today, I have no doubt that all of us here, we stimulated ourselves to be like, hey, I can maybe think differently about this. Now, how can we act upon that? And I think that is a beautiful thing that we've all had. Want to read two quick comments before doing the final question here, which is, it can be a resource. I think it is necessary to teach our youth how to consume social media and how to become social media responsible. Exactly. It presents an opportunity for pretty much everybody out there, right? But we have so much information that it can be like the water, the cup of water filling up, filling up, filling up. It can eventually tower over. And the final question that I would love to have for Kristine, Andrea, and everybody is, we've had this conversation that I have no doubt has benefited us. It's benefited me, and I have no doubt it's benefited everybody else. How can we bring this conversation? How can we have these conversations within our community? So what could be perhaps that first step of creating these forums to just be self-aware, become aware? And there's no wrong answer with this. So Andrea or Kristine?
I think just being open to sharing and being okay with maybe not saying the right thing, or just being open to sharing your experiences and what you can bring to the table. And I think Juan, you said something, when people know that you care about something, that you want to create a change, they'll believe in what you're saying. They'll be enthusiastic to join this change in society. So I think that's
Excellent point. What about you, Andrea?
Yeah, I agree with Kristine. I think being open, curious, asking questions, and being open to have people having different opinions. Yeah.
Exactly. And I want to thank both of you for being incredible resources. I want to thank everybody else for being part of this conversation. I think it's necessary for all of us that we're trying to figure out life. We're trying to figure out how to support our community. And I think this can be a very powerful next step. So as I mentioned, within the next 24 hours, there will be a recording of the session. So that way you can listen at your leisure and you can benefit from the information. There is going to be the evaluation form. And this has been part of the MHTTC efforts to promote resiliency, within the youth and young adult Latinx community. And if you have any questions or comments, you can reach out through all of the emails and social media that have been previously attached to the emails that you've all been received. So have a warm hug from Puerto Rico from my behalf. It has been a pleasure, and I hope everybody has an incredible afternoon.